Captain Jerk Thompson had spent most of his life bouncing between star systems in a patched-up shuttle that smelled faintly of burnt circuitry and old coffee. So when the summons arrived from the alien queen, he assumed it was another bureaucratic error. The holographic message had flickered into his cabin with an eerie elegance. A translucent figure with long ears, tilting in a way that suggested she was either very curious or mildly amused, had announced that he was to present himself at the palace immediately. "They must have scanned the wrong human," he muttered to the cat-sized maintenance drone hovering nearby. "Or maybe they want someone who can't pronounce interstellar treaties correctly. That's me in a nutshell." The drone chirped in agreement, or at least Jerk hoped it was agreement. It had a tendency to beep sarcastically at him. When his shuttle landed on the floating docking platform, the palace itself loomed above him like an impossible crystal mountain suspended by invisible beams. The air shimmered with bioluminescent particles, and as he walked across the transparent bridge, his boots squeaked against a surface that seemed too clean, too perfect, almost alive. One misstep could send him plummeting into the void, but of course, gravity fields subtly adjusted, and he found himself at the grand entrance, awkwardly bowing to no one in particular because the attendants, with their long, elegant ears and luminous eyes, had already passed through him like he was air. Inside, the hall sparkled with floating orbs that displayed data streams in colors he didn't have names for, each orbiting with a lazy, nonchalant motion that made him feel as though he had stepped into the middle of a cosmic ballet rehearsal. The queen waited on a raised platform, draped in robes that shifted color as if reflecting the moods of everyone present, or perhaps just her own whims. Her long ears flicked slightly with every whisper in the room, giving her an aura of constant, subtle calculation. "Ah, the human," she said, her voice smooth, melodious, carrying a hint of humor that made it impossible to tell if she was mocking or welcoming him. "You have been chosen." Jerk blinked. "Chosen for what?" he asked, though the words sounded ridiculous even to his own ears. The queen's smile widened, not maliciously, but in a way that made him question whether she had just invented the concept of irony for interstellar diplomacy. Her attendants whispered among themselves, each glance heavy with speculation, as if deciding whether he was a blessing, a threat, or merely a new source of comic relief. One elder, whose long ears drooped in a very dignified way, leaned toward another and muttered in a language that sounded like water slapping against metal. Jerk caught a few words that sounded like incompetent, unpredictable, and possibly lunch. He decided it was best not to ask which referred to him. The queen gestured elegantly toward him, and suddenly holographic panels projected maps, star charts, and diagrams of starships, all spinning in zero-gravity arcs around the room. Jerk staggered to avoid walking into a rotating asteroid the size of a small moon. "Careful!" A hovering projection of a star map warned in a voice that sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic AI. "Humans are fragile." Jerk muttered, "Thanks for the vote of confidence," earning a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle from the queen. He realized immediately that humor was a survival skill here, perhaps as important as knowing which end of a blaster to point outward. When she finally explained his selection, it was in the vaguest terms possible. "You are exceptional," she said. Her long ears twitched, tracking his heartbeat or perhaps his thoughts. He wasn't sure which. "Exceptional in ways even you do not yet understand." That didn't explain anything, but it did make him sweat slightly under the pristine, ambient lighting. "I'm great at surviving space debris," he muttered, "and terrible at paperwork." The queen tilted her head, and he could swear he saw the ghost of a smile flicker across her face. "Your clumsiness is intriguing," she said. As the hall emptied, leaving only him, the queen, and a few hovering surveillance drones that seemed more interested in sipping ambient light than spying, Jerk stumbled over a small floating table. "Okay," he whispered to himself, "this is either going to be my best adventure or my quickest death." The queen didn't move to correct him. She simply watched with those luminous, knowing eyes, and he felt simultaneously exposed and oddly comforted. In the following days, Jerk's life became a carousel of absurdity and danger. He learned that the palace had elevators that moved sideways, corridors that occasionally rearranged themselves, and kitchens where ingredients could levitate into a soup if they felt slighted. He was introduced to the Council, a group of beings who appeared to have mastered the art of overcomplicating simple tasks, and who considered human blunders either hilarious or horrifying, sometimes both simultaneously. One elder suggested that he serve as a human peace ambassador, which translated roughly to stand here and make everyone laugh while they negotiate galactic treaties. Another insisted that his presence might be used to distract hostile fleets while the Queen maneuvered behind the scenes. "You're basically cosmic comic relief," Jerk said, and the Queen's soft, almost conspiratorial laugh filled the hall. Yet beneath the humor he began to notice patterns. The Queen's long ears didn't just twitch with emotion, they seemed to sense intention, read lies, and detect hidden amusement. She watched him, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with amusement, and occasionally with a glimmer that suggested strategy far beyond anything he could comprehend. When he asked why she had chosen him, she simply replied, "Because unpredictability is a rare and valuable resource." That left him unsure if he had been complimented, warned, or conscripted into some elaborate experiment. One evening, while attempting to operate a device that translated the Council's endless debates into something resembling a human language, Jerk cracked a joke about alien bureaucracy. The Queen laughed, a sound that seemed to resonate across the crystalline walls, making the floating orbs wobble slightly in response. In that moment, he realized something important. Surviving this bizarre, luminous, absurdly elegant court would require equal parts caution, wit, and the ability to laugh at himself, even when the stakes were interstellar and possibly fatal. And somehow that thought made him feel, for the first time since landing, like he might just have a fighting chance. By the time the first week ended, Jerk had tripped over holographic floor projections, accidentally insulted a council elder's ceremonial robes, and learned that some alien food screamed if overcooked. Yet in all this chaos, the Queen's enigmatic attention remained unwavering. Her gaze followed him, her long ears flicking with subtle precision, and though he didn't fully understand her motives, he could sense a connection forming, one that threaded humor and danger together into a strange, delicate balance. It was exhausting, unnerving, and yet oddly exhilarating. And so, Captain Jerk Thompson, scratched, bruised, and slightly singed by over-enthusiastic plasma cables, stood at the center of the alien Queen's court, realizing that his life as a human soldier had just taken a turn into something far more absurd and spectacular than any training manual or combat simulation could have prepared him for. Jerk had begun to understand that being the alien Queen's chosen human was less about ceremony and more about improvisational survival. Each morning, he awoke to a palace that seemed intent on testing both his coordination and his patience. Gravity in the hallways sometimes shifted sideways, teacups floated rebelliously out of reach, and holographic floor projections occasionally morphed into moving obstacles shaped like asteroids or miniature black holes. "It's like running an obstacle course designed by a sarcastic AI," he muttered, narrowly avoiding a projection that had taken the form of a miniature neutron star. The Queen's laughter followed him from somewhere above, subtle, almost conspiratorial, as though she were genuinely entertained by the sight of a human dodging theoretical celestial catastrophes. The Council, a mixture of long-eared elders and younger, sharper-witted diplomats, had begun to involve him in their endless debates, though mostly as a kind of living, breathing jester whose mistakes could be mistaken for clever strategy. "We need your insight," one elder said solemnly, waving a hand that seemed to produce holographic ribbons of light with every motion. "The human perspective is vital." Jerk, leaning against a floating lectern that refused to stay put, replied, The human perspective is that everything is confusing, slightly terrifying, and sometimes explodes. Happy to help. The counsel blinked, or at least he assumed that was blinking, and one of the younger diplomats scribbled notes at high speed, probably recording his words for historical reference or to use against him later in negotiations. The Queen's long ears twitched as she observed him, faint traces of amusement and calculation flickering across her face. She had a peculiar habit of appearing silently behind him at the most inconvenient, or hilariously inconvenient, moments, such as when a food replicator erupted in a shower of levitating vegetables. "I think you're improving," she said one day, her voice carrying that strange mix of jest and authority that made him simultaneously terrified and flattered. "Though the vegetables still seem to fear you." Jerk saluted with a limp hand, narrowly missing a floating cucumber, and replied, "I promise to only terrify in moderation." Despite the chaos, he began to notice patterns in her behavior that hinted at a deeper purpose behind his selection. Her long ears weren't just ornamental. They moved with a precision that seemed almost surgical, detecting subtle shifts in tone, vibration, and intention. On more than one occasion, Jerk realized that his minor blunders, stepping on a floor panel that projected an embarrassing holographic replay of his missteps, mispronouncing alien terminology, or accidentally spilling glowing drinks, had caused the Queen's ears to flick subtly, followed by a small, almost imperceptible smile. It became clear that she valued his unpredictability, his human capacity for error, and perhaps even his humor as tools in ways that no one else in her court could comprehend. One morning, he found himself assigned as the human liaison to a delegation of Zyrian diplomats, a species renowned for negotiating wars without ever raising their voices, which made their debates sound like cosmic lullabies. He had been handed a translator helmet that buzzed faintly and occasionally emitted high-pitched squeals. "This is going to be fun," he muttered as he adjusted it, watching the Zyrians' long, delicate antennae sway in perfect rhythm with their unintelligible language. Every mispronounced syllable or awkward pause caused the helmet to emit a tiny spark, which he quickly learned was meant as encouragement, positive reinforcement. He asked aloud, ducking a spark that fizzled dangerously close to his ear. The Queen, appearing behind him in that sudden, eerie way she had perfected, gave a slow nod and a small, approving smile. "Adaptation is key," she said. As the days unfolded, Jerk became something of a spectacle. Couriers carrying messages in zero-gravity tubes often mistook him for part of the palace decor. Mistimed anti-gravity fields sent his boots sliding along walls in elaborate patterns, and he frequently found himself entangled in conversations that sounded more like interstellar riddles than diplomacy. Yet through it all, he discovered that his humor, often sarcastic, occasionally accidental, served as a surprisingly effective bridge between species. An elder attempting to explain a treaty that involved the orbits of 3 planets paused mid-gesture when Jerk quipped, "So basically, it's cosmic hopscotch." The room froze for a heartbeat, then a ripple of laughter spread through the council, even reaching the Queen's ears, which twitched with amusement. The Queen herself began to involve him in more delicate matters, subtle lessons disguised as chaotic mishaps. One evening, while attempting to recalibrate a gravity containment field that kept the palace's floating gardens in place, Jerk accidentally triggered a low-level anti-gravity surge that sent flower pots tumbling into orbit. He braced for reprimand, but the Queen appeared silently, long ears twitching, and observed him with a calm gaze. "You see things differently," she said. "You react in ways we cannot predict. That is valuable." Jerk scratched the back of his neck, a little embarrassed, a little flattered. "So I'm basically the universe's most expensive stress test?" he asked, eliciting a faint chuckle from her. Even in moments of absurdity, the court taught him lessons in survival and observation. He realized that subtle cues, tiny shifts in light, a flick of an ear, a barely audible hum in the walls, often carried more weight than spoken orders. He learned to anticipate mischief from holographic systems, navigate treacherous corridors that seemed intent on rearranging themselves, and respond to alien etiquette with a mixture of mimicry and improvisation. Each blunder became a lesson, each accident a stepping stone toward understanding the strange, elegant logic of the Queen's world. Then came the night that changed the tone entirely. A minor revolt in the outer colonies required the Queen to make a calculated show of strength. Jerk was not meant to participate directly in combat, but she had positioned him in the observation chamber, where he could monitor communications, analyze patterns, and most importantly, provide unorthodox insights. When a malfunction caused a secondary weapon system to go live, Jerk improvised a solution that no council member had anticipated, averting disaster with a combination of instinct, guesswork, and accidental brilliance. The Queen's ears twitched sharply, and she smiled, that small, knowing smile that had become both a warning and a compliment. "You continue to surprise," she said, "even when you think you are merely stumbling." It was in these moments, between chaos and comic relief, that Jerk began to understand the subtle genius behind his selection. The Queen's attention was not merely political, it was strategic, almost experimental, testing the limits of human adaptability in a court where predictability was a weakness. And yet, despite the danger, he found himself increasingly invested, not just as a soldier or an observer, but as a participant in a narrative that twisted humor, diplomacy, and peril into a strange, exhilarating dance. By the time he retired to his quarters at the end of another exhausting day, Jerk reflected on the absurdity that had become his life. Between dodging floating fruit, translating alien debates, and learning to read the subtle flicks of the Queen's long ears, he realized he was evolving. Humor had become a tool, improvisation a weapon, and his mistakes, once sources of embarrassment, were now part of his survival strategy. He grinned to himself, murmuring, "Who knew being a cosmic clown could be so useful?" In the quiet of the chamber, the palace seemed almost to hum in approval, the floating lights pulsing gently, as if the building itself acknowledged his growing role. And somewhere beyond the walls, the Queen observed, her long ears attuned to every subtle vibration, her gaze weighing intention and unpredictability with careful amusement. Jerk Thompson, human soldier, cosmic jester, accidental diplomat, had begun to navigate a universe that valued chaos as much as order, humor as much as strategy, and above all, the unpredictable brilliance of a single human in a palace that defied all logic. By the time Jerk awoke that morning, the palace seemed almost familiar, though still full of the subtle tricks that made it feel alive. Gravity pulses now moved predictably, the floating lights in the halls no longer threatened impromptu collisions, and holographic floors had learned to respect human balance, or at least, his balance. The Queen's subtle influence had transformed chaos into a sort of disciplined absurdity, and Jerk found himself navigating it with confidence he had never possessed before. He realized, with a mixture of pride and disbelief, that he no longer reacted with fear to the palace's quirks. He reacted with creativity, humor, and sometimes audacious luck. The day's schedule was already absurdly complicated, with meetings involving Zyrian traders, Silevian scientists, and the Queen's Council, all convening in the zero-gravity auditorium where arguments often took the form of floating geometric shapes instead of words. Jerk, wearing his slightly battered uniform, observed the proceedings like a chess player facing a board made of moving light and shifting gravity. He had learned to interpret every flick of a long ear, every subtle shimmer in the holographic projections, every hint of vibration in the room. Even when negotiations became tense, he had developed a capacity to detect when humor could diffuse it. A sarcastic quip about the Silevians' food replicator disasters here, a joking remark about orbital maps there, and it worked better than any formal protocol. Midway through the day, a security alert flared. Rogue drones from the outer colonies had infiltrated the lower levels of the palace, seeking to kidnap the human liaison as a bargaining chip. Jarek's first instinct was panic, but the Queen's presence beside him, her long ears flicking with controlled precision, reminded him to breathe. "You've learned to think like a human," she said, her voice calm, "but now you must act like one who understands this court." He smiled to himself, realizing that her lesson was both literal and figurative. She had chosen him not for combat skill or diplomacy, but for his ability to adapt unpredictably in a world built on rules he barely understood. The rogue drones swarmed, buzzing like metallic hornets, and Jarek sprang into action. Using his knowledge of the palace's shifting corridors, he maneuvered them into a hall where low-gravity fields made their movements erratic, bouncing them against walls and beams in a pattern that resembled a slapstick routine more than a tactical strike. He ducked a floating security drone that had apparently malfunctioned, quipped to himself, "I swear, they're conspiring against me," and triggered an emergency holographic barrier that trapped the intruders temporarily. By the time the palace's automated defenses neutralized the drones, Jarek had accidentally created a spectacle that impressed even the most rigid of the Queen's council. After the commotion, the Queen summoned him to the observation terrace. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the crystal panels, glittering in patterns that seemed almost sentient. "You've done well," she said, and for the first time, Jarek felt the weight of accomplishment without embarrassment. "Not because you followed instructions, but because you acted when instructions failed. That is why you were chosen." Jarek scratched the back of his neck, the old nervous gesture softened into one of quiet pride. "So, all the tripping over vegetables and mispronounced treaties, that was actually part of my training?" he asked. The Queen smiled, ears twitching subtly. "Yes, chaos teaches lessons that structure cannot." Over the following days, Jarek became an essential figure in the Queen's court. Delegates began to respect his insights, not merely as the human representative, but as someone who could navigate the absurdities of alien logic with an intuitive balance of humor and caution. He mediated disputes by turning tense arguments into playful thought experiments. He discovered vulnerabilities in diplomatic protocols that no counselor had noticed, and he became a bridge between human unpredictability and alien precision. Even the Queen's most skeptical advisors began to see that his mistakes were often the sparks that illuminated solutions hidden in plain sight. Yet the greatest transformation was internal. Jarek no longer saw himself as a soldier out of place, but as a strategist, a negotiator, and an adaptable force in a universe where rigidity often failed. He had learned patience without passivity, observation without obsession, and courage without recklessness. He had discovered that humor was not merely a shield but a lens through which chaos could be understood, and unpredictability was not a flaw but a tool in a world governed by patterns and anomalies alike. One evening, while walking through the floating gardens with the Queen, he noticed how her long ears angled toward him with subtle approval. "I understand now," he said quietly. "You didn't choose me because I was perfect. You chose me because I could survive, because I could improvise when nothing went according to plan." The Queen's smile deepened, and for a moment, her usually inscrutable expression softened into something almost human. "And in doing so, you became indispensable. Not to me, but to this court, to this world. You've discovered your value where none expected it." The palace itself seemed to acknowledge this new balance. Gravity fields adjusted smoothly, holographic projections now served as guides rather than obstacles, and even the floating lights pulsed gently, in time with the rhythm of a court that had accepted a human soldier as one of its own. Jarek watched a delegation of Silevians struggle with a complex treaty, and with a playful smirk, offered a humorous, unorthodox suggestion that resolved the conflict. Laughter rippled through the council, a rare and unifying sound, and he realized that this was the culmination of his journey, understanding, bridging, and shaping worlds without ever losing his own humanity. As he prepared to retire to his quarters that night, he reflected on the absurd, dangerous, and unexpectedly instructive weeks he had endured. He had tripped, failed, improvised, and even embarrassed himself countless times. Yet each step had brought him closer to mastery of a world that had initially seemed incomprehensible. He had learned to trust himself, to navigate chaos with humor, and to recognize the subtle threads that connected logic, intuition, and emotion across species. The Queen's choice, once baffling, now seemed inevitable. Only someone who could stumble, laugh, adapt, and act unpredictably could truly serve in a court where every calculation had layers of intention hidden beneath the surface. In the quiet moments before sleep, Jerk smiled, thinking of the floating vegetables, the rogue drones, and the endless corridors that had once terrified him. The palace no longer felt alien. It felt like a proving ground where human ingenuity, resilience, and humor had earned their place. He had changed, not merely surviving in a foreign court, but thriving, learning to wield absurdity as strength and unpredictability as strategy. And somewhere above, the Queen watched, her long ears still twitching in subtle rhythm, her expression a mixture of amusement, pride, and satisfaction, knowing that the human she had chosen was no longer the same